Welcome everyone on behalf of the YU Libraries to the second in our Fall Book Talk series. Pulling together a hybrid event was quite a challenge and involved several dedicated people. Chaya Sarah-Cantor, Jay Rosen, the Markham staff, Michael Betancourt and Vicki Edge, and J.B. Holderness. This event is co-sponsored by the Robert M. Barron Department of History and the Yeshiva College Department of English. Professor Jeff Friedman, chairman of the History Department, will introduce the author and her interviewer.
Thank you, Shalamas. It's a particular pleasure to introduce tonight's honored guest and author, Ellen Schrecker. As many of you are no doubt aware, Ellen taught at YU for a quarter century, from 1987 until her retirement in 2013. During that time, I think it's fair to say, she anchored, shaped, and led the history department. We still are very much the department that you created, Ellen. Tonight's event, in other words, is not just a book talk, it's a homecoming. So welcome back, Ellen. Ellen has had an illustrious career and is the author of many highly acclaimed monographs, which revolve around a set of closely related themes: the history of political repression in America, the history of higher education, notably universities, and the history of academic freedom. She is widely recognized as an authority in each of those overlapping domains. Among her many publications, I would like to mention No Ivory Tower, McCarthyism and the Universities, which came out with Oxford in 1986. Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America, published by Princeton in 1999. And The Lost Soul of Higher Education, American Freedom, Corporatization, and the Assault on the University, which came out with the New Press in 2010. Since retiring, Ellen has not been quiet. She's been hard at work, and tonight we will be discussing her most recent opus, and I use that word advisedly because it is a weighty tome, The Lost Promise: American Universities in the 60s, which is coming out with the University of Chicago Press. Ellen will be in dialogue with Paula Geyh, who is associate professor in the YC English department, where she has taught since 2002. Paula's research focuses on postmodern culture in its various incarnations: literary, cinematic, and architectural. And she's the author, most notably, of Cities, Citizens, and Technologies, Urban Life and Postmodernity, which came out with Routledge in 2009. As it happens, Paula is currently teaching a course on the 1960s in the English department. I think we have some of her students in the room with us today. Welcome. So we thought it would be really great to have her enter into an interdisciplinary dialogue with Ellen. We expect that the conversation between Paula and Ellen will last about 45 minutes, after which time we'll throw the floor open to questions. If you're in the room, of course, you need only raise your hand. But to those of you who are participating via Zoom, you can just click on the hand raise icon in the reaction panel at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Paula.
Welcome. Ellen, you became a leading historian of the American University with two of your previous books, which Jeff has just mentioned, No Ivory Tower and The Lost Soul of Higher Education. Could you position The Lost Promise in relation to these two earlier books and tell us how you came to write it?
Sure. What happened was I was originally trained as a European diplomatic historian and wrote a PhD thesis on the French debt to the United States after the Second World War, after the First World War, and was quite bored by the whole thing and realized I did not want to continue as a European diplomatic historian. And so I was sort of trying to figure out what to do with myself intellectually. and started teaching a freshman composition course at Harvard that you could turn into your own little seminar. And I decided I'd teach on the 50s. That was a period when I'd grown up. I was interested in getting background on my own life. And of course, was very interested in McCarthyism. I had lived through it and discovered there was nothing I could give my students. This is in the sort of mid-70s, but there was nothing I could give my students. So, rather presumptuously, I said, I'm going to write it. And I was fortunate, I got a grant, I got a book contract, and then I got a lot of advice from other scholars saying, McCarthyism, that's too big a subject, narrow it down. So I thought, okay, what am I going to narrow it down to? Maybe I was going to do a city. Luckily, I didn't do that. Instead, I thought about looking at its impact on an institution I knew very well, which of course was the university. And I spent quite a long time doing a lot of archival research and also tons of interviews, often to people who'd never spoken about how McCarthyism had affected their lives. And the main discovery I made was that, the university sort of proclaimed it was a defender of free speech and academic freedom, and it behaved as badly as every other institution in American life. But then I went back and I did write the bigger book about McCarthyism, and I wrote a few more things about McCarthyism and other things on the Cold War. And then decided I didn't want to do any more McCarthyism. I became very interested in academic freedom issues coming out of this first book, and wrote a book that they've mentioned here, The Lost Soul of Higher Education, about around the turn of the century, looking at what American universities were like, what were their main problems. And being a historian, you always sort of want to look at origins of things. So I assumed, I certainly knew about the 50s, I had done some research on the earlier period, and I had assumed somebody else had written up the 60s. Well, turns out there was nothing, zero, zip, nothing about academic freedom and faculty members during the most turbulent moment in American academic life ever. But I wasn't sure I wanted to write about that. And I sort of skipped over it. I did a few interviews, a little reading, but basically was dealing with a more contemporary situation in the early 21st century. And then later, I was on the verge of retiring from yeshiva, and I needed a project. Once you're a historian, you don't stop. And realized that there was this big hole right in the middle of the 60s that nobody had tried to synthesize what had happened in the 60s in the academic community, where clearly it's on the front pages. It's a major player in everything that was going on at the time. And I decided, well, I'll do it. And I did a lot of interviews. And originally what I was going to do was write about my own cohort of left-wing academics and activists in the 60s. It was going to be what they technical term is prosopography, a kind of group biography. But as I began to work on and talk to dozens, more than 100 academics, I realized that I couldn't just focus on this little group, but I really had to look at a much broader cohort of all faculty members. Nobody had looked at the 60s from the perspective of the faculty, and faculty is very important. They not only do they provide the instruction, but they're the kind of institutional memory. They're the people who've given their entire career to this institution. Often they're very identified with their own school. And so to have not ever run across a book that talks about how they responded to what was going on in their school during this very crucial period seemed to me in need of work. But once I began looking at the faculty, I realized it had to be expanded a little further because you can't talk about them without dealing with the institutions within which they're working. How did the academic community as a whole respond to the challenges of the 1960s? And so ultimately, what I ended up writing was a political history of higher education in the 1960s. And then I realized, oh, that's the middle piece of my trilogy that I didn't even know I had written. So anyhow, that's how the book came about. It took a long time, but the research was a lot of fun.
This book traces the arc of American universities from the golden age of the late 1950s and early 60s through the turmoil of the mid and late 1960s and on into the early 1970s. What do you see as the two sort of, or maybe more than two, as the main themes of these two periods?
Well, there are really two different themes that sort of are interwoven to make sense of what was going on. One is the enormous expansion of higher education, and the other is the impact of the quote-unquote 60s, the movements for greater democratization, the civil rights movement, of course, and the anti-war movement in particular. And they all sort of interwove, they affected each other. The expansion was unbelievable. I mean, the enrollments doubled and tripled within the decade. The number of institutions grew by a third. And the mission of American higher education changed. Originally, it was fairly elitist, and you could have a perfectly satisfactory middle-class career without going to college. But after World War II, it becomes pretty clear that a university education of some kind is the passport to the middle class. Certainly a passport to the professional class, and that it supposedly served the same function in American society in the first part of the 20th century, in the 20th century, as the frontier presumably had done in the 19th. It was a sort of source of social mobility. And it attracted a whole new cohort of both students and faculty members, people who had previously been excluded from American higher education. Many of them people from ethnic backgrounds, people of color, and that they're bringing into the campus a lot of serious problems from the outside world. And so it's this moment of huge expansion, and the expansion was incredible. I mean, people, they were throwing money at students, and not just at good students, any students, to go to graduate school. because there was the fear that the baby boomers were about to explode onto the campus and there wouldn't be enough faculty members for them. So this, in a sense, my generation, we had grown up in the 50s, we were part of the so-called silent generation, and all of a sudden they're throwing money at us. Jobs were amazingly easy to find. I know this is sort of unbelievable in this rather straitened moment in academic life, but many of the people that I interviewed had several offers, 1, 2, 3. You could choose what city you wanted to teach in. When my ex-husband didn't get tenure at Princeton, he and I decided we wanted to live in either New York or Boston, and we got 2 very good offers from each city. So it really was a golden age in that sense. But it, of course, came to an end. And what I'm looking at is how that transformation of the campus of higher education, its expansion, its culture changed. It became much more focused on research, much more competitive in that sense. And you saw like teachers' colleges, local teachers' colleges turning themselves into 4-year institutions, those 4-year colleges then turning themselves, offering master's programs, trying to offer PhDs. There's a pressure and an upgrading throughout the academic community, and that led to a lot of conflicts because there was still the traditional school there was a traditional faculty, not particularly caring much about doing a lot of research. And here comes, 50% of, where was it? I think it was SUNY Albany. Within 2 years, 50% of its faculty in certain departments was brand new. So there are cultural clashes here. And on top of that, of course, you get these major social movements, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. The women's movement is there, but just beginning, as well as a movement toward a democratization of the university. Students demanding that they participate in decisions about their own lives. And this is a movement against parental hours for women. It's a movement against dress codes. Turns out that there are more protests against dress codes than anything else. Women had to, when I was in college, women could not wear pants. They had to wear stockings. They couldn't, skirts and sweaters. You could wear pants on snow days, and you could wear them above the second floor of your school, of the dorms. So anyhow, there was a lot of constraints, as well as a rather outdated curriculum that had to be dealt with. So that really is this conflict as well, much more serious one, I think, than over the dress codes, over how do you deal with the powerful civil rights movement, where universities are beginning, and you have to remember that American higher education is completely segregated. There might be 1 or 2 students in a class. Certainly in my class at Radcliffe, there were 2 Black students. One was a foreign student from the Caribbean, the other was passing. It was lily white or all Black. And that began to change, in ways that were very disconcerting to, especially to the Black students who are sort of thrown into an institution that is totally unprepared to deal with them. And they're making demands for more Black students. They are socially isolated. They're having a really miserable time. And the university doesn't know how to deal with them, and certainly doesn't know how to deal with them when they begin to make demands to have the university pay attention to what they needed.
Could you speak more about what American universities contributed to the civil rights struggles?
Sure. They were, to begin with, much of the early civil rights movement, certainly in the early 1960s, was not necessarily born, but certainly intensified on the campuses of the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities. These are the schools where the students are going out, sitting in at restaurants, sitting in at movie theaters, trying to integrate parks and libraries and stuff, and creating enormous problems, of course, for the administrators of their schools, who really had the job of trying to keep the campus quiet, and they couldn't do it. This was a movement that had enormous support within the Black community. The leaders of these schools were under enormous pressure from the white supremacist power structure who ran the board of trustees, or worse yet, the local state boards of education. And so what you have is a lot of turmoil in the South. This is where the most violence took place on Southern campuses. There are a lot of campuses that you haven't heard of: Orangeburg, South Carolina State and Orangeburg, I forget, Southern University, where there were shootings. You know, we know about Kent State, but there was a lot more violence on these Black campuses because the students really were making demands for a relevant education. They were not making trivial demands. They were making demands for what they needed to get the education they had made so many sacrifices to get.
So many students went south in the summer of 1964 for Freedom Summer, and then they came back to their universities in the fall. Could you talk a little bit about what happened when those students returned?
Well, these students had actually been participating in the civil rights movement in the North. There were pickets in front of some of the National Change Woolworths 5 and 10 cent stores. Was a big national change chain where the sit-ins began, and students would go out and picket in front of these northern white students. I went out quite a lot. Would picket in front of these chain stores as an act of solidarity. And what they are getting as well is a sense that you can change things. That's what the civil rights movement was beginning to do. It was beginning to show people that you could go out into the streets, demonstrate, maybe shake things up a bit, and change might come. And what we have immediately after the students came back from Berkeley, from Mississippi Summer, is they encountered at Berkeley, which was the preeminent public university in the United States. It was just the most famous. They even had a wall in the physics department showing all their Nobel Prize winners and reserved special parking spots for Nobel Prize winners. Berkeley was really big time, so it couldn't be ignored. And the people who came back from Mississippi and from participating in some of the actions in the Bay Area to desegregate stores, to get the stores to hire Black workers, are confronted with what was, strangely enough, one of the most politically repressive universities in the country, even though it's full, by the mid-60s, it's sort of bubbling with political activity. But the university is cracking down on what they were doing. They could have gotten punished by the school for their extracurricular political activities. This was extremely repressive. And to be that repressive at a school as, what can we say, advanced as Berkeley was something that the students began to protest. And it was brand new. This was the first time that students had engaged in civil disobedience. They took over a building, directed against their own universities. Or before that, the student protests, like in the South, were against, external institutions. They were off campus. But this was the first time they began to protest about this particular issue.
So this became the Berkeley free speech movement.
Yes.
And I would really like you to speak more about that, because I know it was a kind of crucial trigger for many of the things that came later.
Yeah, it was a prototype for the student unrest. And the thing that really blew my mind as I began looking at Berkeley, and there was tons of literature about Berkeley, was that I had not realized, and it had never been pointed out by anybody, that at the moment when the free speech movement occurred, the Berkeley campus housed a very high proportion of the major sort of public intellectuals, the New York intellectuals, on the faculty. They had come, there was Nathan Glazer, there was David Reisman across the bay in Stanford, there was Seymour Martin Lipset. I mean, it was a long list of very prominent sort of commentators on American life. And they believed, many of these people, that they could solve the problems of the universities, that what the students were doing, resorting to civil disobedience, taking over a building, that sort of wasn't a very good idea. They didn't approve of it. And they thought they could work with the students through the particular channels and solve it that way. And I quote in the book a wonderful anecdote about one of these very famous sociologists named Lipset, yeah. What's his first name? Seymour Martin Lipset. Senior moment. And Seymour Martin, the Berkeley sit-ins, the Berkeley free speech movement began when the police came onto campus to arrest a student who had been sitting at a table on a particular plot of land that had been traditionally used to recruit people for political activities. And the university decided that this was illegal and they stopped it. But the kids still kept sitting there, and one of them was arrested and put in a police car, and all of a sudden students rushed the police car, sat down in front of it, wouldn't let this kid out, wouldn't let the car move, and people began to get it on the roof of the police car to give speeches about what was going on, about academic freedom, about free speech, about why they should be allowed to recruit students on campus and not get punished for it. And Lipsett gets up. He's a very eminent sociologist, has been writing about academic affairs, and says, well, he's trying to convince the students to operate within the official channels, voting and deal with these issues that way. And the students look at him and say, but we can't vote. And he says, well, what you're doing is wrong. And they say, what are we doing wrong? And he says, well, there's a lot of violence. And he says, what violence? And the students are saying, what violence? There's a dialogue going on. And he says, well, there's property damage. And they say, what property damage? It hadn't gotten to the point yet where kids were routinely breaking windows. And he says, well, this police car, it's being damaged. People are standing on it. And the kids say, but you're standing on it. And I actually interviewed Lipsett, and he's a very, very large man. And so so apparently he just sort of looked a little sheepish and got down off the car. But what was happening was that these New York intellectuals really couldn't handle the students. They didn't think the students' resort to civil disobedience was justified. They didn't think that what the students were demanding was legitimate, when in fact it was completely justified. But they could not handle the fact that they weren't in charge. And over the next few years, they specialized. Many of these people wrote book after book after book about the student revolt, about what was going on. Very hostile, claiming that the students were irrational, claiming the students were really acting out some Oedipal revolt against their parents, and creating a scenario that much of the rest of the country and the mainstream media was ready to accept, of the students as crazy and out of control, when in fact what was happening was that nobody in the university during many of these protest movements, and most of them were quiet and picket lines and nothing really disruptive. But when they did get disruptive, it becomes they overreact. And you see the police being called, which creates in many institutions a sort of escalating cycle of violence that hits the front page and turns the American people, the public, really off of universities. Why can't faculty members, why can't administrators keep these kids under control? And it has implications for the later period as well.
As you pointed out, calling the police often did lead to an escalation. Why do you think universities responded so poorly to the student unrest of the late 60s and early 70s? It seems like they ought to have been able to come up with something better.
The main thing is that nobody had ever experienced this. There had never been in the United States major political protests within the university. There were no rules. You know, what university sort of disciplinary codes dealt with was freshmen who are flunking chemistry, you know, guys who were caught with girls in their rooms, sort of, as one person put it, they were doing sort of family type discipline, you know, because there was this system of what was called in loco parentis. But dealing with students who are attacking the university for doing, for example, military research at a time of the Vietnam War, for students, for universities that were unwilling or unable to implement Black Studies programs, which was one of the main demands that the Black students were making on their institutions. And so they really didn't know what to do. And they're under, especially the public institutions, which are, some of which are, you know, expanding enormously and becoming very different kinds of schools than they were originally. I'm thinking here of a school like Buffalo, which was just overwhelmed with one crisis after another during the 60s. It had been a private university, very sort of locally oriented, and all of a sudden it becomes, or it tried to become, a major Berkeley of the East. It didn't quite make it, but you know, there's a huge cultural conflict going on, and there's a lot of pressure from politicians to crack down on the students, get them out of the buildings. You know, if you have to arrest 700 kids, arrest 700 kids, and they did. And this didn't exactly look good. You know, nobody was happy during this period. And, you know, in my own work, I realized I sort of started out very pro-student, you know, very much involved with the anti-war movement in a small way, and began to understand a lot more about what faculty members must have felt like during this. You know, on some campuses, the kids would come into a classroom and say, "We're on strike, out of this classroom, shut it down." And, or they demand to give a speech, you know, explaining that the school is involved in military-related research, which doesn't belong on campus, or that they have to get rid of the ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Program, on their campus. And people were just, it was scary. It was very scary, you know. Cops were beating people up, students were running wild, burning down buildings. Not every school, not every school. But it was amazing how badly so many administrations behaved. They just really wanted to crack down. They felt they had to restore control. And the faculty members that, you know, I'm looking at all these different groups. Faculty members were terrified. They were scared. Some were scared of the students. Some were scared of what might happen if the cops came in. And they really didn't know what to do.
On some campuses, once the Vietnam War started to really amp up in the mid-60s, mid to late 60s, there were teach-ins, there were protests, and other anti-war activism in which many faculty members did participate. Can you talk a bit about the activism on the campuses that was against the war, and what effect do you think it might have had on the wider American public?
I think it was absolutely crucial. This was one of the main points that I make in the book, is that until the war escalated in 1965, there was nobody, literally nobody, within the American university who knew anything about Vietnam. It had been a French colony. What was known was written in French, because nobody knew Vietnamese. And so when the war begins, or when the war escalated, it'd been going on for quite a while before 65, groups of faculty members who had been slowly raising their own political concerns. They were concerned about Cuba in the beginning of the 1960s. They were concerned about the civil rights movement. And a few, small handful, were they were concerned as well about nuclear weapons. But by 65, there was the realization that they had to act. They wanted to do something. And it turned out that a small group of about 25 faculty members at the University of Michigan got together to decide to do something. And they were thinking, well, maybe they do send a petition around. There were lots of petitions around during this period against nuclear testing, against the war in Vietnam. And they decided instead that they would hold a moratorium and stop classes. Well, that created a big to-do. The president said you can't have a strike or stop classes against the university. The Michigan governor, who was the father of Mitt Romney, no less, said no, they can't possibly strike against the university. And so they decided, okay, we're going to hold a teach-in. We're going to hold it at night. And it's going to be teaching the students about what was going on in Vietnam, how it fit into the bigger picture of the Cold War, and why it was wrong. And this was incredibly important. It got a lot of attention, and it spread very quickly from Michigan. By the spring of 1965, there were hundreds of universities holding these teach-ins, often addressed by their own faculty members. If they could find somebody who knew anything about Vietnam, that person was in great demand. And I had a list. A friend of mine was very active in a magazine called Viet Report, and he kept a list of the hundreds of schools that he went to give talks in at that time. So what we have to realize was that it was academics in the beginning of the escalation of the war who really jump-started the anti-war movement by teaching the rest of the nation what was wrong with the war. And gradually, over the next few years, by 1967, most academics opposed the war, and most Americans did too.
Do you think that those activities influence the decision makers in Washington as well?
Yes, more than the decision makers in Washington would let on. But also, they didn't directly stop the war, which some of the more radical anti-war activists wanted. They thought, well, we're going to burn draft cards. This is going to be a protest. And they were going to burn so many draft cards and cause so many kids to get arrested that the jails would be flooded and the administration would realize that the country was becoming ungovernable. That didn't happen, but it did make a difference. To begin with, many of the protests, again, ones that began early on university campuses, were directed against the draft. This affected students very directly. They had what was called a 2S deferment, and that 2S deferment kept them out of college, out of the draft, as long as they were in good standing in their schools. So the statement, the sort of slogan was, well, you could get an A, B, C, D, or Vietnam, And faculty members were opposed to having their grading, which was something they had control over, have that much of an impact on their students' lives, especially ones who did not approve of the war. So, yes, by the late 60s, there was so much unrest on the campuses, especially over the draft, that in fact the draft was stopped.
What were the most surprising things you discovered during your research?
Well, one was this enormous role of the public intellectuals in creating a scenario of irrational, out of control students. I hadn't realized how hostile they became. They were really, really hostile to the students. And that had a lot of impact because these were guys who were writing, well, they didn't even have op-eds in those days, but they were writing articles every week on the crazy students in the, say, the Sunday New York Times Magazine, or, in the mainstream media. So that this anti-student hostility was being disseminated by the nation's most important public intellectuals. That was very important, and it's something of a surprise to me. And it got picked up, by politicians, by the general public, so that we can see it, the hostility to this unprecedented unrest on American campuses, turning the American people against higher education in a very important way. And I'm giving a talk later this week, and one of the people who's commenting on it claimed, well, he wasn't so sure that Berkeley was that important, for example. And I realized that, well, I think it was, and I could give the importance in one word, which was Ronald Reagan, that his political career was based on opposition. He ran for governor of California in 1966 against Berkeley. And he comes into office, and what's the first thing he does? He makes sure that the president of the university is fired. The legislature, at the same time, when it is looking at the budget of the university, make sure to refuse to grant the automatic cost of living raise to faculty members in the University of California system and the California State College system. That they are, and it's this desire to punish the universities that we see even to this day.
It sounds like that was really the beginning of the disinvestment in higher education that continues to this day. I wonder if you would talk a little bit, not just about that, but about sort of what you see as the main legacies of the 1960s.
Very much. What we're learning or have learned since the 60s is about the fact that it inspired a group of businessmen, very, very conservative businessmen and libertarians, among them the Koch brothers, to mount a campaign against what they felt was the liberal influence of universities and their faculties that was turning a whole generation of students against the business community. And so they mounted a very conscious campaign to change American political culture. And they did this through subsidizing think tanks that would provide a kind of right-wing libertarian economic philosophy. They did this by later on subsidizing right-wing student groups that would bring conservative speakers to the campus. By the 1980s, you have the whole campaign against political correctness, which it turns out had been self-consciously created by this right-wing business campaign, right-wing network of interlocking institutions that funded, they funded whole departments and funded programs throughout American universities to sort of eliminate the influence of academic expertise. This is a very serious problem that now we can have, climate denial and COVID denial coming directly subsidized by these right-wing groups that really got their start in the backlash against the 1960s on campus.
So I'd like to open the floor for some other people to ask questions, both in the room and on Zoom.
Right. So, why don't we start with taking questions from participants in the room, and then we have a number of very interesting questions in the chat function, which I may try to synthesize, since some of them are clustered around a set of common themes. But why don't we start? Yes.
Professor Geyh basically asked my question, but do you believe that the disinvestment, that the sort of attempt to not fund schooling is a result of policing being such a failure that they couldn't stop all these movements through force, and they kind of took a back channel. And that's why you have loans instead of grants and such things.
So what?
And that's why you have loans instead of grants now. And
Yeah. That's what a lot of it is the political decisions not to fund education. It's also, one has to admit, it's part of a broader movement of kind of toward a more neoliberal economy, one that is much more focused on the market and is pushing a view of trying to shrink the public sector. And clearly, in my middle book, the last book of my trilogy, where I talk about the universities in the 21st century, this is part of a defunding of the public good. They're pulling back in every area, and universities are bearing the brunt of a lot of this.
So one more question from in the room, and then we'll go to the chat function. Yes.
I'm curious if this institution came up at all in your research, and if you have any insight into what was happening at Yeshiva University during the 60s and how students here might have reacted to.
Well, it was very interesting. I had a very, very good student at one point who wrote a senior thesis with me about yeshiva in the 60s. And he, I think, researched a lot, in the school newspaper and stuff. And by the late 60s and early 70s, the war was incredibly unpopular on campuses, including yeshiva. There was an anti-war movement. And they were concerned about, at one point, they were thinking of doing some kind of protest action. But of course, they wanted to make sure to clear it with the rabbis. And I think that there was some kind of compromise reached. I think they were dealing with Rabbi Soloveitchik, who, sort of found some kind of compromise. Yeah.
I think in the late 60s and 70s, the yeshiva boys were very interested in the Soviet Jewry movement.
Yeah,
so
that was,
maybe they, a lot of their energies went into that, but that was also kind of a
yeah.
social protest movement, and they went out, they demonstrated and so on. They had a lot of activism in that direction.
Yeah,
so,
but they were also,
well, they were afraid to be drafted. I mean, they had to go on to rabbinical school, otherwise
right.
they would be drafted.
That was what I was told as well. That
Yeah,
one of the big changes
of
at yeshiva in the 60s was this huge wave of people becoming rabbis.
But then they didn't have to practice. But they wanted the degree.
Pardon.
And another thing, I noticed that after the protest, another reaction of I guess you could say the administration, a lot of these schools started taking, to get into the Jewish aspect of it. I know the people from Kent State were Jewish and so on. A lot of the freedom, summer freedom people were Jewish. The schools started taking more Orthodox Jews because they considered them more conservative. They wouldn't be the kinds that would riot and so on. And so the admissions policy of these places changed to take, people that they thought were more stable for this situation. So I was interested in the Jewish aspect of it. And I know a lot of the liberal professors were Jewish. There must be a certain, and I don't know if it caused anti-Semitism, but a lot of these participants were known to be Jewish, so I'm just wondering what the Jewish aspect was.
There wasn't anti-Semitism in the sense that there probably would be today. But there were a lot of Jews in the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
And that caused, especially at schools where these sort of second-tier state colleges that had just begun to expand, and they're bringing in new cohorts of people, faculty members who are much better educated than they are. They're coming from top tier schools, whereas many of these people just don't even have PhDs, but had been running the schools up until this point. So there's a lot of cultural tension.
So we have a number of questions in the chat, which I think I can synthesize some of them because they cluster around a set of themes. And many of them have to do with your original point, Ellen, about the expansion of universities. And so questions came up about the extent to which the expansion applied equally to public and private universities, and to what extent the GI Bill was a driving force. And also some question about how many Blacks were actually entering universities in the 1960s. You spoke about the historically Black colleges, but was the enrollment of Blacks at major universities increasing at this time too? Those were some of the questions that all had to do with the expansion of higher education in the 60s.
Okay, well, the GI Bill, of course, brought a huge new cohort of middle class and working class men mainly, into the universities. We haven't been talking a bit about gender here, mainly because it became an issue a little bit later. But it was the fact that up until the 60s, or up until the Second World War, I think half of the schools in the United States were private and half were public. And then the expansion occurs, and it's mainly the upgrading and massive expansion of the public institutions, but the private ones grew as well. I mean, I was shocked to discover that Stanford in 1945 had like 3,000 students, and by the end of the 60s, it was 11,000 and something. A huge expansion of graduate education as well. And graduate students tend to be more political in many fields, and it varied by fields. I mean, there's sort of tons of different ways you can approach it as well. I mean, obviously business school faculty members weren't too active in a lot of these things, whereas psychologists or English professors certainly usually were.
So there was a question about the enrollment of Black students?
Yeah, well, there were very few Black students in majority white schools in the North and in the South. They are by 1965-66, the white schools in the North are trying to decrease their Black enrollments. And they get them up to, in certain schools, 10, 15%. Then it drops back down. Because these students are not getting any support. They are socially isolated. Especially if they're on campuses that are sort of out in a rural area, where there's, the kids who were at Columbia could make connections with the local community in Harlem. They did. But, where are guys who are about to integrate? There may be 20 Black guys at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And there are no Black girls for them to date. They're really stuck. If they try to date white girls, they can get beaten up. I mean, it's very, very tough for them. The assumption was among the academic administrators and faculty members who were dealing with these new students was that they were going to have academic troubles, but they didn't really do very much to help them. So it was not, they got upset.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question from the Zoom audience. Lori Goldenstone? Huh? Yes. Yes.
I unmuted myself.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hi, I wanted to comment on how divergent faculty experience during that time was in 1965, say, and later. And in a lot of private colleges, there was a clear division between older and younger faculty. It was clearly generational. And young faculty members who were closer in age to the students that they were teaching. This would also be the case in some larger universities like Columbia and so on and so forth, that there was really a lot of common cause between young faculty and protesting students, as I remember it. But when we came to, say, Skidmore, much later, 20 years later, people said that the divisions existing in the English department 20 years later were entirely due to the different positions that people had taken during the
60s.
During the 60s, and that those deep divisions of opinion had lasted for decades later. But the other thing, I don't want to make this too long. The other question I wanted to ask about, just generally, what was happening to relations between the generations. And as I recall this being around at the time, that the better economy, the expanding economy, made it possible for veterans, for a lot of people coming into these expanding colleges, to be much more indifferent about how they had to toe the line and follow the institutional patterns. And that generation of students and those generation of younger teachers also felt freer to thumb their noses at institutions and to say, well, we really can do better and do differently. So that feeling, never trust anybody over the age of 30, which was certainly one of the comments that everybody said, whether they went to college or not. It seemed to me that there was also generationally and sociologically an environment that would have led many of the students to be more resistant to what the conventional message was for what they should do with their lives, and that it had a lot to do with resistance and the desire for reform in higher education at the time and in education generally. So the economy and the generational thing, plus the splits within the faculty themselves, I think I just wanted to point to that.
I also want to speak to some of these issues because you and I, Ellen, were teaching in the universities and present in the universities at almost exactly the same years. I began teaching at an engineering university, and there was no interest by the students for 2 years, from 59 to 61, no interest in political issues at all. I was teaching Cry to the Beloved Country in one of my classes, and I made the class. I was teaching at Illinois Institute of Technology, which was built on the site of an infamous housing project called the Mecca. And there's a wonderful book by Brooks about the Mecca. It's called the Mecca. It was a sort of ingeniously designed for disaster housing square of houses surrounding a smaller square of houses. And there were no social support. The entire residents were basically underprivileged black families, and it turned into a social and criminal disaster, and they tore the whole thing down. And Illinois Tech built on the property with Mies van der Rohe as the head of the architecture department designing the school. It was a very impressive place to look at. The students were mostly coming from parochial schools, and they were utterly not interested in politics. I took them through the slum area that surrounded the school, saying, hey, you know, this isn't only South Africa. Look at the conditions that our neighbors a block away are living in. No response from the students about that. My next teaching.
No, thank you very, very much. I think we're going to maybe let Ellen have the last word, and then we do have to bring this to a close. Ellen, did you want to respond maybe to the economic conjuncture and how that influenced the culture of the period?
Yeah, this is the period when, it is the golden age. They're literally throwing money at people to become academics. It's very popular. There was one survey of students, that the top half of a graduating class, I forget where, all wanted to become academics, but so did the bottom half. So it was really very popular. You could get a job. What was amazing was that unlike in the 50s, when people got into trouble during the McCarthy period, they could be blackballed and kicked out of the profession. In the 60s, people got jobs. You could almost burn down your university and still get a part-time teaching job. Literally, I had a friend this happened to. The jobs were there.
Right.
And it did, as you pointed out, embolden people to become much more willing to challenge the status quo. This was something that was very characteristic of the 60s. And part of it was just the economic security. You knew you could get a job.
Right.
My generation, we were just lucky. Then the trap door shut and that was it. But for the generation of the 60s, this austerity did not exist. It really didn't.
Right.
And it created a very different mindset.
Well, with that, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Ellen and Paula for an incredibly stimulating conversation, which of course has enormous consequences for our current moment. We barely scratched the surface. We'll have to do a sequel. But I'd like to thank both of you and Ellen in particular for this really wonderful discussion. And also I would like to call your attention to the fact that we have a promo for Ellen's book. And how does this work, Ellen? If people go online with promo code Schrecker, they get a 25% discount from the University of Chicago Press. And I strongly urge you to take advantage of it. It's a great read and a really important piece of work. So thank you. I'd like to ask everybody to thank Ellen and welcome back, Ellen, once again.
Thank you. That was really fun.